Welcome to an episode of Historically Speaking. Can you tell that we are functioning in times of COVID? This is our last Historically Speaking episode of 2020. And although this is a year that we will all remember for a lot of reasons, and we have been challenged to do things that we take for granted in everyday life, I did not want this year to pass away without our acknowledging a very important historical anniversary. 1920 marked the passage of the 19th Amendment, and in this program we are going to take a look back at the steps that led to the passage of the 19th Amendment, which is women's right to vote. And our sources for this presentation are going to be images from the Library of Congress and the archive of the Rutland Herald. The 19th Amendment, women's right to vote. It was passed by Congress on June 4th, 1919, ratified on the 18th of August. And with everything that we were experiencing in August of 2020, it passed without much mention. It's important for us to know what the words are of that amendment. The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or any other state on account of sex. Congress shall have power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. We are going to be looking at some of the significant people and events that led to this long struggle for women to receive the right to vote. We need to go back to Seneca Falls in the summer of 1848. Wherein Elizabeth Cady Stanton, a 33-year-old wife and mother, wrote the report of the Women's Rights Convention. And as we can see here from this image from the Library of Congress, this is the frontispiece that came from that important meeting. In the words of Elizabeth Cady Stanton, these are some of the important and powerful words that would guide the way in the reform effort for women to gain the right to vote. Resolved that woman is man's equal was intended to be so by the Creator, and the highest good of the race demands that she should be recognized as such. Resolved that the women of this century ought to be enlightened in regard to the laws under which they live, that they may no longer publish their degradation by declaring themselves satisfied with their present situation, nor their ignorance by asserting that they all have the rights that they want. And later, in probably the most famous part of the convention, we have the Declaration of Sentiments. And here, Elizabeth Cady Stanton echoed the words of Thomas Jefferson in the Declaration of Independence. And in the second paragraph here, we have the change in the words that we know so familiarly. And that is, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. These were radical words for the time. And when we look at the work that Elizabeth Cady Stanton did, we have to realize that her efforts were part of a larger reform initiative that most prominently included abolitionists. So we have a combination of social reformers, women's rights abolitionists, and others who are combining in this effort. This lovely Library of Congress image here shows Elizabeth Cady Stanton with her daughter Harriet from a daguerreotype in 1856. Thus far, I have not mentioned the other fountainhead of the 19th Amendment, and that is Susan B. Anthony. Susan B. Anthony was not present at the Seneca Falls Declaration in 1848. She did not become involved in the women's rights program until 3 years later. And together with Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan Anthony made headway through the Civil War years. But one of the things that happened is the women's rights issue became somewhat dispowered by the fact that with the passages of the 13th, 14th Amendments following the Civil War, the women no longer had the support of prominent abolitionists like Frederick Douglass. For the rest of her long life, Susan B. Anthony worked with Elizabeth Cady Stanton, but with the passage of time, it would be Susan B. Anthony that soldiered on as the voice of the movement. And here we have the two elderly women by this time, both in their early 80s when this image was taken around 1902. Elizabeth Cady Stanton is seated and Susan B. Anthony is standing. When I was looking for how the death of Elizabeth Cady Stanton was reported at the time that it happened in 1902, it was very much a surprise for me to learn that only 10 Vermont newspapers even bothered to report the death at the age of 87 of this woman who was so critical in the women's rights movement. The only newspaper in Vermont that allowed this piece of news to be on the front page was the Orleans County Monitor, and it appeared as the small clipping General News. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, the well-known woman suffragist, died at her home in New York on Sunday, October 26th. Old age is given as the cause of her death. She was 87 years old. She had been in failing health for several days, and the end had been expected daily by her family during the past week. There's absolutely nothing in this clipping that in any way indicates the life, the work, and the achievements of this woman. And I think that's an important thing for us to realize, that sometimes we have to go back in history and see how things were recorded and perceived at the time that it was happening. When we look at the archive that the Library of Congress has for Susan B. Anthony, this is a marvelous teaching resource for anyone who is looking for more information on this subject. And I think we have an example here of beautiful handwriting in this letter that Susan B. Anthony wrote on the eve of the Civil War. And to quote a bit of this letter, it reads, "We are assembled here this evening for the purpose of discussing the question of American slavery." Now remember, I've said that at this time, on the eve of the Civil War, the women's rights advocates were allied with the abolitionists. And Anthony goes on to say, "The startling fact that there are in these United States, under the sanction of professedly Christian Republican government, nearly 4 million of human beings now clanking the chains of slavery." And what she goes on to say here is that not only are African Americans within the chains of slavery, she also says that many women are suffering a similar degree of oppression. Throughout her long, long life, Susan B. Anthony was photographed frequently, and she truly became the poster person of the women's suffrage issue. We have an autographed carte de visite image of Susan B. Anthony, widely circulated in the 1870s. And in this particular photograph, I find it interesting that in the Library of Congress cataloging system, they said that this print was from 1915. And of course, Anthony by that time had been dead for 9 years. And the image that we see here is Susan B. Anthony, probably from a daguerreotype or a glass plate negative around 1870, and the way that it was cataloged is that it was reprinted in 1915. Of all the images that I've seen of Susan B. Anthony, I'm fascinated by these 3 images that were taken in the early 1890s. So we have all by the same photographer in Washington, D.C. So we have Anthony here looking quite statuesque, in a pose reminiscent of orators and generals. Another view of this. But the one that is strangest of all is here is Susan B. Anthony with our back to us. The Library of Congress and the sequencing of these images gave us no clue as to why we have this image of Anthony. Maybe she's looking towards the future, but actually I think that these represent most likely a study for a statue. And this photographer was photographing Susan B. Anthony from a variety of angles to perhaps make a study for a bust. And there were several busts of Susan B. Anthony made during her lifetime. By contrast to Elizabeth Cady Stanton, whose death passed virtually unnoticed and was not reported in any Rutland newspaper in 1902. When Susan B. Anthony died in 1906, it was widely reported all over the country, and as part of the archive that is in the Library of Congress, we can see all of these tributes here. We have the image as most people would remember her from the history books as an elderly person, and then we can see images of her parents and her birthplace, etc. With Anthony's death in 1906, it took a while for the women's suffrage issue to gain national attention again. And the person who propelled this to a national issue once again was Alice Paul. And here we have Miss Paul seated looking at the gravestone of Susan B. Anthony. This was taken in about 1913. Under the subject heading of suffrage in the Library of Congress catalog, I came across this image, and first I thought, did they misspell suffrage, S-U-F-F-R-A-G-E? Well, this is part of the archive, and I think it's worthwhile for us to look at some of the images of the well-organized opposition and why it took 72 years between the close of the Women's Rights Convention at Seneca Falls in 1848 and the final passage of the women's right to vote in 1920. So we have a piece of sheet music here with a four-man quartet, and I think it's important to look at the lyrics. And in this, I guess this would be 2/4 time, not too fast. These are what the words say. Now, Josie was a married man. His life was always smooth with Nan until women got to vote, and then the poor man got a jolt, etc. So there was much organized opposition to women getting the right to vote. One of the things that we have to consider is what was the overall context that finally allowed the 19th Amendment to be passed and added to the Constitution in 1920. And here we have to take a minute to identify the platform of the progressive era of national legislation that was filed in the early 20th century with a cluster of constitutional amendments whose broad goals were to restore government to the rank and file of the people. And between 1913 and 1920, we have several constitutional amendments added that did, among other things, directly elect senators, levy income tax, and what we also have to understand is the 18th Amendment about the prohibition and distribution of alcohol. The 18th Amendment and the 19th Amendment are going to be linked together. We will be looking down the road at the forces of temperance and prohibition that led to the passage of the Volstead Act and the 18th Amendment. But what we have to realize is that many women who were at the forefront of women gaining the right to vote in 1920 were also very, very strong in the temperance issue. And in the context of World War I, we have many mass rallies of women's rights advocates and temperance advocates clamoring for the right to vote. And at that time, it was not ultimately called that, but as this piece of legislation became moving forward as a bill, it was called the Susan B. Anthony Amendment. And here we have a World War I era picture of a monster mass meeting to welcome the envoys of women's voters. And finally, in 1920, here is an image of Alice Paul, still a young woman, raising a glass, not of an alcoholic beverage, but this is probably a glass of grape juice, and that she is toasting the final passage of women's right to vote. As we start to look at the newspaper headlines, let's take a look at the chronology. The steps towards ratification began in February of 1920, and then it would require ratification by 2/3 of the states. And as it became more likely that it would be adopted by through ratification by the states, we also see some of the forces of opposition here. So if we look at this headline from the Rutland Herald on April 3rd, 1920, we see that suffrage advocates will try to change the anti-suffrage vote. And the delegation starts on a tour of Delaware to work up public sentiment. And one of the things that follows in that same headline is anti-suffragist leaders felt secure and declared, so far as Delaware is concerned, the Equal Franchise Amendment is dead. They said that Mr. DuPont's announcement, he was the governor of Delaware, would have no effect whatsoever, pointing out that some of the most powerful political influences, both national and state, had already been brought to bear on behalf of the measure without success. So let's look further at some of the reasons why, as it became evident that the amendment was going to pass, what the reasons were to prevent women from voting. We have this headline from the Rutland Herald on July 10th, 1920. It states, declares women are cheapened by the suffrage, has brought an alarming increase in morality in California. And then reporting from Tennessee, because Tennessee became the final hurdle by which it became the last state to ratify the 19th Amendment. And in this dispatch from Knoxville, it reads, Miss Annie Block of Los Angeles, formerly an equal suffrage leader. In a letter to W.K. Anderson, representative in the lower houses of the Tennessee legislature, urges him not to support ratification of the suffrage amendment. Suffrage, she says, coarsens and cheapens women. She expresses her regret at her former activity in its behalf, saying that since suffrage has been granted, there has been an alarming increase in morality, divorce, and murder in California. The letter follows, I was one of the prominent workers who helped to bring suffrage to California, and I regret it. A year in politics has taught me that women are intolerant, radical, revolutionary, and more corrupt in politics than men. Also, all this so-called reform leads to the socialist cooperative commonwealth. And again, we can see that eventually the forces came to bear, that in spite of the organized opposition of people that did not want women's suffrage, we can see that by the 26th of August, the Rutland Herald is recording this, Tennessee antis declare suffrage amendment lost, and we do have by the 26th of August the ratification of the 19th Amendment. And in this particular headline from the Rutland Herald, it reads, suffrage ratification will enfranchise 25 million women. And again, the article details some of the compelling history of all of this. The amendment introduced to Congress in 1878, before the country longer than any other successful amendment to the Constitution. And I must say, as a historian, I don't think that's entirely accurate, because when we look at the work of abolitionists who wanted a constitutional amendment to ban slavery, it certainly would have been more, at least in its impetus, if not in the desire for the creation of a constitutional amendment. And again, when we look at the actual ratification of the 19th Amendment, it was overshadowed by some of the other headlines. So here we have the old banner of the Rutland Daily Herald, and just look at some of the other things that were on the headlines in 1920. We have a strike, a tumble in coal prices, and the Bolshevik armies before Poland now consist of but 30,000 fugitives. And it really, something as important as the ratification of the 19th Amendment, I would have thought that this would have been the banner headline. And here, when we can see a sizable image of what that full headline looked like, it's not exactly the blazing headline that we thought it would be when it's in probably the fourth column, more than halfway down the page. And at last, we have the victory of the presidency, the return to normalcy, the election of Warren G. Harding in 1920, and that cry returned to normalcy after the World War I years. The Democrats had been in the White House under Woodrow Wilson since 1913. One of the things that Wilson faced extreme unpopularity in was his fight for the ratification of the League of Nations. Warren G. Harding ran a front porch campaign, and his cry, his motto of a return to normalcy resulted in a very big election indeed. Here is the banner headline from Wednesday morning, November 3rd, 1920. And again, not a lot here about the role of women in all of this, But throughout the state, we can see here over on the left-hand side, women, big factors in the election, polling heavy in all sections. And again, Vermont in 1920 was very much a Republican state. And as we look back on these important events, I think it's very important for us to realize that what we see in a history book is a condensed and sometimes stripped of important detail account of an event that was both complex and a long time in coming. And we have at our fingertips today, through resources like the Library of Congress and the Rutland Herald Archives, we can see as primary sources the words, the writings, the opinions, and how all of these events came together. And as we approach the centennial of a very memorable decade in American history, the interwar years, the Roaring '20s, it was very much a decade that was characterized by so many changes, beginning with women's right to vote. But I know that I want to look back in 2021 and see how Prohibition actually played out. And although it's rare for a constitutional amendment like the 18th Amendment to have been repealed in 1933, one of the things that we have to realize, the passage of the 18th Amendment coming just before women's right to vote was immensely popular in its time, and not everyone thought that it was a good thing for Prohibition to be repealed by 1933. So as we will continue to bring you, historically speaking, episodes in 2021, we can all look forward to our own return to normalcy, whatever that new normal is going to be. And our best wishes from me and the Rutland Historical Society for a better new year.